Welcome back, and I'd like to say a huge thank you to Professor Tulloch for chairing the previous session, all the speakers. It was amazing and session and warrants a symposium in itself. I'd now like to introduce Professor Paul Goodwin, who is Director of Train Research Centre and Chair of Contemporary Art and Urbanism at UAL. Paul is a curator, researcher, and educator. His research focuses on Black British art and African diaspora art since the 1980s and transnationalism in contemporary art production. Paul is also a member of the Africa Regional Group, and he has been at the forefront in advocating and championing the Africa agenda at UAL, and has been, as I said earlier, a critical friend and supporter throughout this process of getting this symposium in place today. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Maureen. And I like the reference to being a critical friend. I hope not too critical. Can everyone see me? Because I can't actually see my camera. My camera is on, presumably. And can everyone hear me?
I can see you, Paul.
Yeah. Sometimes on my screen, I can't actually see everyone. I can only just see, at the moment, I can just see Maureen. So I'm not quite sure how to fix that. Okay, so listen, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this second session, which is on research, enterprise, knowledge exchange, partnerships, and collaboration. We want to, in this session, drill down into the kind of infrastructure of these exchanges and how we can, what are the challenges that this sector presents, and how we can kind of move forward with deepening and enriching those partnerships, taking into account the various contexts, which I'll talk about in a second. What we'll do is I'll quickly just give an overview of what the session is about, and then also some of the questions that we'll be looking at. Each presenter, and we've got a fantastic panel of Professor Toussaint Mohula, Dr. Renee Smith, Professor Taibat Loanson, Ojoma Oshai, and also Oba Nscube from the Africa Centre. And what I'll do is I'll introduce each person just before their talk, which will be roughly for 5 minutes, we've said, although it may go over a little bit. And that will allow us, hopefully, that will allow us to reconvene and have a bit of a discussion among ourselves to address some of the questions that Maureen set out for us, which I will talk about in a second. And then we'll have hopefully some time for discussion. And I want to also congratulate the first panel, as Maureen said, which was a fantastic panel that I think opened up put on the table many of the questions that I think we'll be discussing in this panel. So firstly, I wanted to big up Maureen, actually. And Maureen and I first actually met on the continent as two British Caribbean scholars. Didn't actually meet in Birmingham or London or Brixton, we actually met for the first time in Senegal, right, in Dakar, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, I would add, where Maureen had been working for many years, actually, working in the university in Dakar and engaging in research and knowledge exchange. And this is something that Maureen's been doing. That was over 10 years ago. And Maureen's been doing this for many years. So I think I want to acknowledge that I think she's a real pioneer in this field. And this conference, where really we're platforming this wonderful discussion and listening to scholars from the continent, but also scholars of African heritage, in London, I just think is a unique chance for exchange and listening. So I wanted to really thank Maureen for that. I think the fact that we met in Senegal also brings up another issue, which I think Divine talked about. He talked about the idea of imperial time and the problems that we have around that. But also, Senegal is a quote unquote French speaking country. And I think if you look at the range of voices that we have here, we are in a way following a kind of imperial geography and which I think is something we should take into account, that Africa has many, many different languages. And so we can't necessarily just work with those imperial and colonial languages. So language group, that's not something that I think we should also follow up on. I also wanted to thank Sophia Foka, who's the co-chair of the African Regional Group, and also colleagues in the African Regional Group for supporting this conference, and also to Lynn Finn for brilliantly bringing it together. So in terms of what this session will deal with, this session is aiming to explore the strategic development of African research, enterprise and knowledge exchange, and a focus on its ecosystem and the infrastructure. And the infrastructure came up very much in that first session. We want to address the potential for partnerships and collaboration across this research ecosystem, and to try to identify what are the main challenges, opportunities, and solutions that we can bring to this. That's obviously, if we can do that in an hour and a half, I'll be really happy, but at least we can start the conversation. So in doing this, I think we need to take into account the contexts which have been brought up earlier of inequality and disparity in scholarly outputs and the share of global knowledge. And of course, I go back to Maureen's statistic, a striking statistic, that Africa represents 3.5% of global knowledge, of the global knowledge space, with 50% of that coming from one country on the continent, South Africa. So there are lots of inequalities that we need to attend to in our discussion. We also need to think about and talk about the ethical conditions and equitable conditions for developing and maintaining sustainable transnational, transdisciplinary collaborative research partnerships. And this question of inequality and ethics came up very much in that first panel. Many speakers spoke to that. I think we need to account for that in our discussions. And then finally, we want to consider, or we should also think about the question of the value of research that originates on the continent, right? How can this work be valued? And again, this came up in the first session. How can this work be valued and evaluated, and not just using monetary terms? In short, what we're trying to do in this panel is to think about what are the ways forward for collaboration and partnerships. So the main questions that Maureen has set out for us are three questions. The first one is, what can we learn from how these innovations in knowledge exchange and in research and partnerships, how they are changing the research and knowledge exchange landscape for the benefit of Africans, African diaspora, and indeed the wider world? Just a small question there that we can hopefully deal with. The second question is, what are the different ways to understand and value the work of these institutions? How do we place value on these institutions and the works that come out of them? And then thirdly, I think this is perhaps one of the key ones that we want to try to at least start the conversation is, how do we create a framework or a network or a community of practice for African diaspora research and knowledge exchange practices that are led by African scholars? And I'm heartened by the fact that this conference itself, is very much led by African scholars and by African heritage scholars, which I think is very, very rare. My colleague talked about African studies, but in many other studies, in many other fields of study as well, it's very rare to see a conference that is led by and mostly populated by African and diaspora scholars. So how we'll do this is that each speaker will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. Before I wanted to do that, before I introduce our first speaker, I wanted to just give you, and I'm talking to my speakers here and also to the audience, 2 short provocations just to help frame some of our conversations. One, and they're very short. One is by the writer Audre Lorde, feminist icon, feminist researcher, poet. And she said in a famous essay, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." I repeat that. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I'll leave that there for you to think about. The second one is by the writer Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer Arundhati Roy, who talks about the pandemic. She said, "The pandemic is a portal. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew." Right? So there's two. So the pandemic is a portal. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. And I wanted to give a kind of slightly challenging quote from Audre Lorde, which again came up in the first panel about the master's tool. Can we continue these discussions and these exchanges using the master's tools, which many of us have been trained in? That's a question to think about. And then also, what opportunities for renewal have been posed by the pandemic? That's another slight provocation that we can start with. So our first speaker is Professor Toussaint Kafahiri Muhula, who's president of the African Studies Association of Africa. And Toussaint is a poet, a Jesuit priest, a theologian and literary critic, an executive coach, and a social scientist. He received a BA in philosophy, and a BA, and also a BA in theology. He has degrees in ethics and social theories, and also an MA in political science, and a PhD in global politics and international relations from Chicago, University of Chicago. And his research interests focus on democracy and peace in Africa, in political violence and conflicts, social justice and religion, global health policies, and post-colonial theories. And he's taught, among other institutions, at Loyola University Chicago, the Episcopal Theological College of Pest in Hungary. He's taught in Nairobi and in Congo, in Kinshasa. And he's a member of several networks, including the editorial board of Global Africa Review, the CIHA blog, and many others. And he serves as the current president of the ASAA and the African Regional, and he's also the African Regional Coordinator of the Catholic Theological Ethics in World Church. So can I invite Professor Muhula to speak? Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. I would like also to take this opportunity to thank all the organizers of the symposium, which is really a very wonderful space for us to just have this conversation, about knowledge production in Africa. Very quickly, I would like to summarize a couple of things that I would like to present to you. First, I want to make a statement. Second, I want to share an experience, and you just brought up that those provocative thoughts, about pandemics, the way I've been experiencing the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Then I will just, brush through a kind of epistemological injustice or violence that, Africa has been living through. And finally, I will...
I think we may be having some difficulties hearing you, Toussaint. Okay, Toussaint, I think what we'll do is that we'll move to the next speaker, and then we'll come back to you when we get your sound sorted, okay? If that's okay with you, Toussaint. Okay, so the next speaker is Professor Taibat Loanson, who's Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Lagos. And she's Professor of Urban Management and Governance at University of Lagos, Nigeria, where she leads the Pro-Poor Development Research Cluster, and also serves as the co-director of the Center for Housing and Sustainable Development. Professor Loanson's research focuses on the interface of social complexities, urban realities, and the pursuit of spatial justice in Africa. She's well known for her intersectorial work, which engages students, policymakers, local communities, and civil society actors. Professor Loanson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts about transnational research perspectives from one who has done work with researchers from all over the world over the last 20 years as the African partner. So the nature of transnational research partnerships can either be collaborative or exploitative. The first session spoke quite a bit about that, and collaborative partnerships are preferred, especially when they start from the very from the very beginning with the code development of research proposals from the ideation stage. And then there's equitable partnership to project data, and also equitable recognition of contributions. On the other hand, exploitative partnerships are those in which the project is already decided and funded before the person from the Global North seeks a collaborator from the Global South, essentially looking for a data collector. And then oftentimes, if they have to come over, they fly in for a few days and then return as experts. In this situation, there is less or no acknowledgement of the intellectual contributions of local researchers. And this becomes problematic for those researchers in that trust that is built with the local communities becomes fractured because there is no feedback, there is no going back to them. These challenges are usually from the context of, well, the first session spoke about the funding lines, and that is something that I think responds directly to the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We have to look inwards from the context of Africa and start to think about funding research and being intentional about research trajectories.
Taibat, do you know if you're,
yes.
We're seeing the first page of the first slide. Are you moving them on, or is that intentional?
I'm not sharing the slides. The slides are being shared from the back end.
Okay. So perhaps
just the next slide when you're ready. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
so
you.
I'm on the, yes, you can move forward now to the challenges.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So for researchers in the Global South, the challenges have essentially been, who leads when the focus is on Africa, who benefits, and what's the nature of the intellectual benefits. And then we have these issues around navigating ethical approvals, where, even though ethics committees are meant to be universal, we still have to have a final approval from the institution in the Global North, essentially skewing the partnership and the inference on the quality of the intellectuals in the Global South. And then you have these funding constraints, especially with regards to access to the global knowledge ecosystems. How do you build the relationship if you're unable to access funding to attend conferences, or you're unable, even if you are able to access the funding, if you're unable to get a visa to travel for these conferences? And then we have the challenges of methodological approaches, particularly now that a lot of the funding is focused on multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary types of engagement. We don't train our people for those kinds of engagement. We tend to learn on the job. So how do we navigate that? And then there's the issue of data management, like I said before. And finally, how do you get the researchers onto the world stage, the publishing dilemmas, whereby a paper from a researcher at an African university may get desk rejected, and the same paper by another member of the team that is at a university in Global North will move to peer review. That changes the dynamics of who leads the research, who is the lead author, who is the contributing author. And then also, we find these issues around citation indexes, which journals are approved for publication, and things like that. In the course of my work, especially over the last 10 years, I've been engaged in some partnerships that worked, and I'll just take you through them quickly. Next slide, please. The first is the Arua Center, the African Research Universities Alliance Center of Excellence in Urbanization and Habitable Cities, that is domiciled at the University of Lagos Center for Housing and Sustainable Development. We are leading with 9 other universities in Africa and 4 collaborating UK institutions, because the project is funded by UKRI. And this offers an excellent, next slide please, an excellent opportunity for African researchers to take the forefront in these engagements. And over the last 3 years, we've been able to host conferences or workshops across 7 African universities, with the researchers in those universities hosting. We've been able to support the development of the early career workshop, early career researchers, with many of them being the leads in research management. So beyond research capacities, we are also expanding capacities in research management. And we have been able to publish books and produce a journal. The WITS TUB Unilag Urban Lab is another partnership that has worked, and it's a collaboration between 2 Arua universities, the University of Lagos and the University of Witwatersrand, as well as the Technical University of Berlin. And this arrangement is such that from the point of inception, there has been equitable partnership. We have worked together on developing the programs, on developing the proposals, on determining where the programs are being held, the nature of the programs. And we have also been able to reach beyond these 3 institutions to institutions across the continent, because there is funding to go beyond. And what this has done for us is that it allows us to use those 3 universities as an entry point into the continent, collaborating with other larger networks rather than reinventing the wheel. And finally, I speak about the Global Diet and Activity Research Network. Next slide, please. Yes, excellent. One more after that. Yeah, so this Global Diet and Activity Research Network is a network of about 7 universities across Africa and the Caribbean, as well as the University of Cambridge in the UK. And this follows the same approach. Next slide, please, whereby beyond the individual and institutional capacities, early and mid-career researchers and research management mentorships have been done. And it's largely a researcher-led arrangement. What I find, next slide please, across these 3 partnerships is that there is openness and transparency, and there's a focus on mutual learning and co-production from the get-go. The emphasis is on long-term relationship building, and the SDGs are simply used as an entry point to strengthening, the research capacities, as well as supporting individual and the various institutions that we belong to. And finally, I think there is a need for us to look into enhancing research integrity in the relationships and in the collaboration agreements that are signed between our various institutions, particularly because sometimes data management becomes a challenge. There's also a need for focusing on meaningful collaborations rather than just and relationships, rather than just focusing on a project by project type of arrangement. And finally, for there to be effective participation, there must be respect for cultural differences and a commitment to continuous collaborative learning. I will stop now and yield the floor back to you. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Loanson. I think you raised some really important questions about ethics, about long-term thinking, about respect for differences in the way, and also building capacity in research management, and also working within the continent as well, not just working with the quote unquote the West, but also consolidating relationships on the continent. So thank you so much for that. So next, we hopefully hopefully Toussaint's sound is back with us. Toussaint, are you there with us?
I hope it works this time.
Wonderful.
Can you hear me?
Okay,
Okay,
so
terrific.
The floor is
wonderful.
yours.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Let me share my screen very quickly. Okay, so yes, what I was saying basically is that I would like to be talking about some epistemological violence and maybe introduce the African Studies Association of Africa as an act of resistance and a way to bring, the collaboration that we're talking about here. So very quickly, without further ado, let me make my statement, which is very much about, I would say, the critical importance of Africans to reclaim and regain sovereignty over narratives and discourses that represent Africa in the global world. Very often it looks to me, and we are all aware of this, the African experiences are played down, are dismissed, are denigrated, and sometimes even the effort to process, to produce knowledge, to rationalize some of these experiences are looked down upon by the powers that be in the knowledge production industry. A couple of examples that I would like maybe to just bring to your attention, to your awareness. One would be the current ongoing war in Ukraine. You have all been watching the unfolding of the war and how these powers actually have been trying to drag Africa into taking stand either for or against the West. But this time, I think African leaders have resisted and they have wanted really to show the African agency that we can choose whichever side we want, depending on how Africans begin to define or determine their own interests. The second example that comes to mind really strongly is how Africans have lived through the 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic recently. In major cities that I did visit, whether Kenya, Nairobi in Kenya, or the Congo, we have seen a strong resistance to buying simply what the narratives from the West have been, and try to develop an attitude that reflects much more the experience lived through by Africans. So I will illustrate this resistance simply by referring to some of the narratives that I encountered in the Kinshasa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, popular, representation, which looked at the disease of COVID in the early stages as a disease of people with a passport. This was a political statement showing that those who were being affected mostly lived in cities or they were returnees from the West. This can provoke a whole area of research if we want to pay attention. Another rhetoric or some kind of framing that I encountered among the Kenyans, especially those living in the big slum of Kibera, was what a blogger said to be, the judgment by those with more knowledge, more access to resources from Kenya itself, saying that they found the average Kenyan to be stupid because they would not agree to self-isolate due to the pandemic. But these Kenyans and most of the people who are living in these, what I call the existential peripheries or the margins of the society, these people said, you know what, we have been rubbing shoulders with risk and danger and hunger on a daily basis. Why should we care now? These people were telling, the other group, social group, that now you can experience what we have known for all these years. Welcome, join us, grab a seat. These ways of looking at a reality, social reality, or a life world is a way to show that a scientific narrative and the solutions that are being prompted or imposed on the majority of Africans sometimes may not be fitting their own worldviews or their own experiences. And here I want to also emphasize strongly that the kind of resistance of these, low income or people living in the existential peripheries, Africans, are not stupid by behaving the way they did, because everyone wants to protect their lives, but they were just making a statement that may trigger a puzzle, or at least a way for us to begin rethinking how we have been producing knowledge, for whom, for whose consumption, and from which perspective or standpoint. So this is to simply say that really the perspective that we bring sometimes to knowledge production in Africa, coming from a Western perspective, follows simply the hegemonic episteme, I would say, and continue to reproduce the kind of violence and injustices done to most Africans. So I believe with these examples, or with this conversation we are having, this is a really good place to begin to question what we have always taken for granted, to begin to become aware and realize that there are many other ways of looking at society, at human experiences, by trying to reduce, I would say, the kind of epistemological violence of which Professor Mudimbe and so many other scholars, African scholars and Africanist scholars, have been talking about. So I have mentioned the COVID and the way the Western knowledge production apparatus, whether it is multinational companies in the pharmaceutical industry, whether it is the World Health Organization, whether it is Western government that wield really power, have been trying to produce knowledge, to canonize their perspective about the experience of the COVID in Africa. I followed very closely about the development of statistics in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I've been living and teaching lately. And I saw that there is sometimes a politically driven agenda to twist or falsify, I would say, some of the statistics. That is why I'm quoting from Mark Twain, some of the way that science can also be biased to serve some purpose or some ideology. So just to say, the resistance to the anti-COVID-19 vaccine in Africa was not an act of stupidity, of irrationality from Africans, but it was a subliminal message that Africans are sending to say, let's begin to pay attention to the African experience and reinterpret it in a different way. From there, I want simply to ask, how do we as Africans now begin to frame, to package, I would say, or to tell our own stories, our own experiences, our own certainties or certitudes? This is where I want to land on the creation of ASAA, African Studies Association of Africa, as one of what we know as acts of resistance, I would say. You might be familiar with the scholarship of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who has written a lot or worked on the epistemologies from the South, which he claims aim at producing and validating knowledges that emerge through acts of resistance by social groups subjected to systemic injustices, capitalism, oppression, and colonialism or patriarchy. African Studies Association was established 10 years ago and is still growing and reaching out to really, African scholars scattered on the continent, in the diaspora. And every other year we organize and we host a conference to bring these scholars to share about their personal research and to see where the research agenda stands on the African continent. This has been going on, and we hope it will continue to grow stronger so that we can create this platform where African scholars really can begin that kind of collaboration, mentorship, and push for greater knowledge production from the African perspective. So we really need to begin writing Africa down in history and teaching Africa from perspectives that may be informed by the cultural sensitivities from Africa, and not simply be happy to pass on the knowledge or reproduce the same knowledge that was produced from imperialistic or hegemonic colonial perspective from the West. So this is to say that even when we look at the objectivity of science, we should acknowledge that every scholar, every researcher, every observer has some biases, which could be cultural, political, and so on and so forth, that he or she brings to the measurement of the object that is under study. Maybe to just go very quick because of the time constraints, I will go to the suggestion for collaboration. It looks to me that what Edward Said has said about the space of representation has been monopolized by this, what I called the apparatus of knowledge production from the West, being think tanks, research centers, universities, and so on and so forth. And I think Professor Paul, you introduced the statistics about knowledge production in Africa, and even when we get to Africa, we see that it is skewed towards South Africa, and I would even say towards the Anglophone Africa more than the African studies. One of the speakers before me said that we only have maybe 3 African studies institutes across the continent, and this is also part of what the politics of linguistic languages and coloniality can explain very well. So I believe there are available resources actually out there which are not accessible to many African scholars and researchers. And a way to increase this collaboration would be to see in which ways we can, democratize, I would say, that knowledge which has been produced. I see, Sage, JSTOR, and so many other platforms that, store knowledge, but even subscription for many African researchers remains a challenge. I am wondering also whether, an institution like the UNESCO can be challenged to be an equalizer, a catalyzer among, knowledge produced from the South and knowledge produced from the North, and see how these knowledges can get integrated. I remember spending many years studying in the US, but I don't remember many times that an African research has been proposed maybe to students for analysis or discussion and so on and so forth, maybe beside the novels, as if the parochialism of American, knowledge or the global North knowledge is always shunning what African scholars can produce. So what kind of qualitative impact would higher education get in Africa? Should our own students from Africa, for instance, be allowed to participate in those kind of immersion trip, exchange programs, and so on and so forth? So we need really to continue this conversation and open up the space and democratize the way we understand, first of all, epistemic communities and how we define what counts to be knowledge to be taught. Thank you very, very much. And I'm open to continue the conversation in the Q&A later on.
Thank you so much, Professor Muhula. And again, so many fantastic points there. Obviously, the importance of the epistemological violence that operates and circulates within global knowledge systems, the need to reclaim epistemological sovereignty, which I think is really important, and develop alternative epistemologies, the need to question what we've always taken for granted, you mentioned, and also to put on the table epistemological justice, as you quoted Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos there, and also how do we tell our own stories as Africans, and the African Studies Association of Africa as a form of resistance. I certainly would like to know a bit more about that association and to see how I could become a member, for example.
Welcome. We shall be happy.
Great. So our next speaker is Dr. Renee and Professor Dr. Renee and Alicia Smith, who's head of the School of Arts at the University of Witwatersrand, or WITS, in South Africa. And she is the immediate past president of the South African Humanities and Dean's Association, and was Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Design at Durban University of Technology, where she was founder director of the Arts and Design Digital Festival, DigiFest. She's also on the Creative Outputs and Innovations Advisory Panel of the Department of Higher Education, and on the board of the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. Renee has extensive governance and leadership experience and has served on a range of boards over the past 2 decades, including non-profits like the African Arts Centre, the Art for Humanity, and the Agenda Feminist Media, among many other contributions. So I'll give you the floor, Dr. Smith, and we will look forward to hearing your contribution. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm not sure, Lynn, is it clear on your side?
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you so much. So firstly, just really thank you for the invitation, as well as the introduction. I do want to acknowledge my colleagues who are joining today. I am the new head of school at WITS, so I do want to acknowledge the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Garth Stevens, who, just for his support for the arts. I really want to thank
Renee, I'm not sure if you can hear, but Wi-Fi has had a little blip.
Renee, are you with us? Okay, I think while we sort that out, we'll move to the next next presentation, which is Ojoma Oshai. I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correctly, Ojoma. And apologies if I haven't, who's the managing partner of the creative economy practice at the Co-Creation Hub, Nigeria. And this hub has a mission to stimulate innovation and technology application to catalyze African creative economy growth. The practice delivers the mission through research, advocacy, ecosystem development, and among other things. Ojoma sits on the board of the Trust, an organization set up by no less than Jay-Z and Jack Dorsey, the CEO, of course, and former CEO of Twitter, to support Bitcoin development in Africa and other locations. She's also a member of the UNESCO expert panel on the 2005 Convention on Cultural Expressions, where she has delivered projects in a range of locations around the world, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean. And her 17 plus years of experience spans international cultural relations and leading creative and digital economy projects. So previous roles have included being regional director for the British Council Sub-Saharan Africa Arts and Creative Economy Program, which I believe we met, Ojoma, in Senegal a few years ago. So good to see you again. And also other roles that she's worked on, including projects for institutions like the Swedish Arts Council, the World Bank, and various national governments to support development of the creative economy. So, Ojoma, I would hand over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Indeed, we have met. Good to see you again. And hello, everyone. It's really good to be here. Thanks to Maureen and the team for setting this up. I joined towards the end of the last panel, and it was really interesting to hear some of what was discussed there, which I think sets a good sort of basis for what we're going to be talking about. I'm in Cairo in Egypt this afternoon. I'm here attending the Africa Export-Import Bank annual general meeting, which has the theme realizing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area potential in the post-COVID-19 era, leveraging the power of the youth, which I think is a really interesting backdrop to the conversation that we're having this afternoon. And I hope we can talk about that a little bit as the session progresses. My angle this afternoon is really from a practice perspective. As you were reading there, Paul, my background has been in developing projects and initiatives around capacity building, research, ecosystem development in creative industries in Africa. So I'm really coming from that perspective and talking briefly about research, knowledge, and insights relating to creative enterprise, both from the perspectives of academic and market research. And I framed my initial provocation through the sort of three lenses of the challenges, the opportunities, and some ideas of solutions. In terms of challenges, from a sort of market insight, market research perspective, historically, there's been a lack of data on the creative economy and the creative industries in many parts of the continent. Although over time, that's changing with mappings of the creative industries happening in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Egypt, Botswana, various countries around the world, from as far back as the sort of 2010, 2012, that time onwards. We already have some countries also where creative industries contributions are calculated as part of GDP. In Nigeria, for example, from 2014, when the economy was rebased, as a matter of course, creative industries' contribution to the economy is calculated as part of the national GDP calculations. In some countries on the continent, in their sort of national accounts, there is data that is presented. Having said that, there's still a challenge of locally generated, consistent data around the sort of trends in creative enterprise and the creative industries. There's other market studies and research that's available on the continent. PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, notably have their media and entertainment outlook that they publish every year that looks at the trends around a number of sectors: publishing, advertising, film and television, and so on. So there is some data, and increasingly so from a market perspective, the challenges that remain, because often the data that we have and the sort of market insight and intelligence that we have create a sort of macro perspective of trends, which is useful to an extent. But if you're an SME or a startup working in these sectors, it becomes really difficult and expensive to find city level data, for example, or micro level data or research that's useful for decision making in the business. There's also real issues around ecosystem data, understanding, who are the key players in a city or in a market, which has implications for investment. It has implications for supply chain information. It has implications for the ability to collaborate, just not knowing who's in the ecosystem. From an academic research perspective, as it relates to creative enterprise, there are very weak academia industry linkages. And so we find that even where there is research in universities and higher education institutions into the arts, humanities, and the creative industries, that research does not filter back into the sector. Neither is it informed in the first place, to be honest, by trends in the sector. And so that disconnect means that the relationships between academia and the creative industries are very weak. This is not peculiar, I have to say, to the creative industries, because we find that generally speaking, the linkages between academia and industry in many parts of the continent are weak. There are a few notable exceptions to that. So some of you may be aware of the Pan-African University Centers of Excellence funded by the African Union that are available across the continent. There's 5 different centers. And the African Development Bank is funding a number of initiatives around strengthening the linkages between these universities and industries. So there's one around earth sciences, for example, in Nigeria. There's another one around science, technology, and innovation in Nairobi, and so on. So there's initiatives that have started to emerge to strengthen linkages between academia and industry. And part of what we hope we can see is more of that investment in the arts, in the creative industries, to support those linkages. I've only got 5 minutes. I'm going to obviously be just whizzing through. In terms of opportunities and threats, one thing I really wanted to focus on as a kind of double-edged sword is this idea of digitalization. So digitalization has meant that data on trends of consumption, for example, of creative content, exist now and are much easier to track. And when I think about inequity, in fact, in terms of a threat, the sort of global South divide that has already been talked about is, I won't belabor that point. But I think one thing that we're increasingly preoccupied with is the threat of a lot of the data and insight being held by private, big tech corporations versus the sort of everyday startups and companies in the ecosystem. And naturally, of course, these big tech corporations are from the global North, although not exclusively. Actually, that's probably not even the case. Many of these are either coming from the US or from China. And so a lot of the data and the insight on the trends in these sectors are held by private companies from these two locations that I've mentioned. So there's a massive risk of inequity because it means that the data and the insight that can help innovation and help SMEs and startups to make decisions are held by these private corporations. And often they may or they may not share that data, right? Governments certainly have no sight of that data, which is a massive issue for policymaking and governance of cultural and creative industries. And so I'd be really interested to explore in this call and subsequently about sort of these trends, about where the data sits and who has the sort of access to that data, which I think is an interesting inequity that we're seeing more and more of. Obviously, with trends in Web 2 versus Web 3, which people may be familiar with, there's a lot to talk about decentralization, which is interesting, but which perhaps provides a new set of issues in the sense that while information becomes more visible, transactions more trackable, for example, on the blockchain, the questions for implications around macro level trends then also come into play, because it does mean maybe more individuals and users will be empowered with their own data, but where will then the macro trends come from? But that's probably a whole other seminar in itself. But in terms of going forward and the kinds of solutions, I wanted to particularly pick up on the question that was posed around what is the role of diaspora and in the African ecosystem and vice versa. And a few things that came to mind. One was in terms of the roles and how we might develop frameworks and communities of practice. I think for me, communities of practice and networks they're a functional thing, right? And they are dependent on what the roles are in the different ecosystem. And to my mind, being African diaspora does not automatically confer a role in the ecosystem, or vice versa. Being African does not immediately confer one a role in the diaspora ecosystem. So I think for me, the question about communities of practice will need to start from what's the role of the individual or the collective in the ecosystem? And we start from there, right? And their role then determines what networks they're immediately part of as a result of that role. Because in my experience, I find that the problem with networks and communities of practice is not so much that they don't exist. The problem is more that there are micro networks, right? And so if you've participated in a project, you are immediately, by default, inducted into some kind of network, formal or informal. I find that the problem is more the kind of multidisciplinary networks or cross-border networks. And so the question for me becomes, how do we create networks of networks that enables cross-border collaboration and information sharing or multidisciplinary collaboration and information sharing? And I think the solution to that is really intermediaries. Intermediaries like higher education institutions, because obviously there's a massive network of alumni and so on that can be connected. And it also links to that industry academia linkage that I was talking about earlier. But I think also hubs like the one that I run and others are an important repository of information on the ecosystem. And I just wanted to close on this idea of a research project that we're working on. It's called the African Cultural Vibrancy Index, where we're mapping 12 cities across the continent with funding from Africa No Filter and the British Council to ascertain the extent to which cultural and creative industries in these cities are supported. But then a byproduct of that is that we will create a database of key players across the different creative industries in these cities to start to provide a sort of visualization of density of activity, but also key players to enable the sort of network of networks that I talk about. But I'll pause here and look forward to further interaction on this panel.
Thank you so much, Ojoma, and lots to mine there, to think about, particularly around data. And I thought it was really important about Nigeria integrating creative economy into the national GDP calculations. I think that's a really important way forward, but also the question about digitalization and threat of data being held by private tech corporations. Where does data sit and who has access, I think is really, really important. Okay, we are kind of slowly running out of time, but I think this meeting is about, laying down initial questions, and we'll definitely, I think, have a follow-up. So Rene, I see you're back with us, and I'll hand over to you, and we look forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And just apologies, but it was really as I was speaking to the fundamental challenges. So I'm not sure what to make of that. So just to say that I was really deliberate about wanting to focus on the what I've certainly termed the creative economy and practices valuing African research. And I wanted to say that it was deliberate because, in a sense, I think it's important that we recognize that the arts have not been recognized for a long time. And I wanted to really center the developments that have taken place in South Africa, which is something I can talk to, and hopefully offer this as an opportunity for deepening and enabling collaboration. So the presentation is really, the first part of it is about the context. It's South African policy framework as well as national reports. I'll then just talk briefly to developments with respect to the creative economy and practices in the country. And I really do want to just acknowledge the previous speaker works closely with a colleague of mine, Avril Jaffe. And then I want to talk about the recognition of peer-reviewed creative outputs, which is an important moment in South Africa. And then finally about the Wits School of Arts, where I am, in the Arts and Arts Research Africa. Now, there are a couple of projects, or rather policy documents, that are really critical in South Africa. And one of them is the White Paper for Post-School Education and Training. And what I want to refer to here in particular is the focus on increasing research and innovation and improving quality of research, as well as the insistence that we recognize that all that we do must be about development. And in South Africa, it's about our national development. The other point I wanted to make was around the importance of this document spelling out the establishment of the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences in South Africa. And certainly, I want to state here that the contribution that the NIHSS has made, and one can really see this through the annual reports that are publicly available, around the catalytic research projects, around the scholarship projects, which are not just for South African students, but also through the partnership with Cudestria. It's for students from the rest of the continent. So this is a really important document, and I wanted to acknowledge it. The second document I want to acknowledge is the report on the quality of South Africa's research publications. It's a CREST publication for DHET. And what it talks to and what it really sort of highlights is that traditional research still dominates, that journal articles constitute the biggest single output category. And of course, it does show us that there's been growth in terms of books, book chapters, conference papers. So why is this important? It's important because, of course, we, as you know, in South Africa, have for many years, there are many activists and scholars before me who have been campaigning really and advocating for the recognition of peer-reviewed creative outputs. And in 2017, we have a national policy that was approved on the evaluation of creative outputs and innovations by the Department of Higher Education and Training. And there are implementation guidelines, which the latest of which was revised in 2021. And what this policy talks to is that, one, obviously it's applicable to creative outputs, which is fine arts, visual arts, and music, theatre, performance, and dance, design, film, and television, and literary arts, but also innovations, right? So, and this includes registered patents. And it was a really important moment, I think, in South African higher education. And we recognize that we have this policy. It may not be perfect, but there's certainly, it's here now, it's recognizing what we do. And we're hoping that the next round of policy review will afford us an opportunity to refine it a bit further, to grow the different fields and subfields. The third or fourth document I want to refer to is the economic mapping of cultural and creative industries in South Africa. This really is important, certainly the latest report from SACO, the 2022 report, which reminds us that the largest domains in terms of contribution in South Africa is design and creative services, and this is growing. Secondly, audiovisual and interactive media, also growing. Thirdly, visual arts and crafts. And then, of course, books and press, performance, cultural and natural heritage. The second finding that I think is material, not just because I'm in Johannesburg now and at WITS, but the Gauteng province dominates the creative economy activity in the country and provides employment to 32% of South Africa's workers in cultural occupations. I think this is significant because it's followed by the Western Cape at 14% and then KwaZulu-Natal at 18.2%, certainly the other way around. And so what this says to us basically is that there's an increasing recognition for the contribution of the cultural and creative industries to economic growth, employment, and international trade. And this is partially as a result of the Mzansi Golden Economy Framework, certainly for us in South Africa, which really reinforced the idea that these industries are not only important to notions of identities and well-being, and certainly for South Africa's social cohesion, but also in terms of employment. It was also identified by South Africa's revised industrial strategy as a priority sector, that's the cultural and creative industries. And the National Research Project, which is the South African Cultural Observatory, which was established in 2015 by the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, does these mapping exercises every year. And so we have these reports that come out, the SACO's 2018, 2020, and 22 reports, which are really important for us because they provide industry or sector relevant information about the economic value of the cultural and creative industries in South Africa. They focus on SDGs, impact of COVID-19, and also interventions and adaptations. So who is the School of Arts at WITS? Well, I really do invite you to go online, read more about us. I don't really have much time because of the connectivity issues earlier, but I did want to highlight a couple of projects. And the one is the Arts Research Africa ARA project, which is a Mellon-funded project which seeks to collectively explore and define artistic research in Africa. It was launched in 2017. It enables artists in residencies or artist residencies, postdoctoral fellowships, symposia, colloquia, various research grants. And if you go online, you'll find our podcast series as well. The second conference takes place this year in the 15th to 16th of September with the theme, How is Artistic Research Transformed and Advanced Pedagogy and Artistic Practice in Africa? This is just to give you an indication of what the Arts Research Africa team are involved in. And I also wanted to use this opportunity to talk to a dynamic, innovative festival which we run called the Fakugezi African Digital Innovation Festival, which really was a collaboration with the Chimologong Digital Innovation Precinct, our digital arts department, as well as the entire School of WITS School of Arts. Again, please, you're most welcome. It is definitely for us. This is an African festival, something we're very proud of. And certainly you are most welcome to join us from the 13th to the 21st of October. But as I round off, I wanted to go back to the 5 questions that actually were posed as part of the symposia. And it really got me thinking. The one was around global context and local context. And for me, I thought this was really important to think about it in terms of the questions that were posed, what the opportunities that we are presented with. And the one with regards to local context is really about us supporting African innovative solutions. We know these exist. We feel that it's not just a matter of empowerment, but really it's about being able to showcase it and offering it as an opportunity for collaboration. So it must be Africa-led for the next phase, these international projects. To the second questions around partnerships for change and transformation, of course, this is something that we all engage in. Certainly my own school is engaged with discussions in this regard. And this is really the opportunity for us to look at the intersection of the arts, social, economic, and environmental justice. And core to this, I argue, is the issue of allyship. And what we have learned about allyship, that it's not necessarily for us as Africans to be able to explain many of the issues that were raised earlier, but it's really about our allies being able to identify it and then creating room for that space for African-led international research projects. To the third question around African creative practices, absolutely, it's about valuing African thinking and perspectives. And at the heart of this is inclusivity in its fullest extent. The fourth question was around research and development collaboration. And here an earlier speaker spoke to the multi-inter-trans, as well as the post-disciplinarity that I think we're needing to engage in, to question. And this presents new paradigms for us. And I think we must invite them, we must challenge them. And I think the international collaboration and partnerships will help us do that better. And then lastly, digital technologies, knowledge exchange and research collaboration. Of course, I mean, the opportunity here is for us all to do what we can to bridge the digital divides. This is a very real challenge for us. But we do know that there are many partnerships that do already exist in this area around online international collaborative research, as well as online international collaborative teaching and learning. So I really wanted to thank you for this opportunity, to really invite you to please do join us. Certainly at WIZOA, we have a number of partnerships which we are proud of, both with the continent and with the other colleagues in the Global South and the Global North. And just to thank you once again for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Smith, for really outlining for your focus on African arts and creative industries, as Joma talked about as well. I mean, just some of the few things that I caught out there is about the importance of valuing the creative economy, that the African-led international research projects, the question of allyship, which I think is something that we've started to discuss, that creating space for African scholars within these collaborations, inclusivity, new paradigms, post-disciplinary paradigms, I think is really important, and of course, online collaboration. So thank you so much, Renee. We now have our last, but certainly not least speaker, who is a colleague of mine, Oba Nzube. I'm just looking for my notes here. Who is, so Oba and I work at the Africa Center, work on the trustees, the board of trustees. I'm on the board of trustees. Oba is the chair of the Africa Center, which has just recently opened the new building, which I'm sure Oba will talk about. So Oba is a graduate of Hull University in the UK, and he is one of the leading lawyers in the UK and in Nigeria. He was called to the bar, he's a SAN, and he's called to the English bar as well as a QC and a SAN and a professor. Was called to the English bar in 1985, Nigerian bar in 1986. As a lawyer, he's a broad international practice with particular interest in Africa. And in 2002, aged only 39, many years ago, he became the first Nigerian practicing abroad to be promoted to Queen's Counsel QC. Age 35, he had been appointed as a part-time judge of the Crown Court of England and Wales, the youngest in the country at that time. Oba is well known as well as a passionate lover of the arts, and he's trustee of the Yunkushane Barry Foundation and the New Curators Foundation. He's a past member of the Tate African Arts Acquisition Committee. In 2020, he featured in the Nigeria Guardian's publications 60 Nigerians in 60 years, making Nigerian lives matter. And also in 2021, he was named Nigerian Magazine's, is part of Nigeria Magazine's 20 Persons a Decade. Oba, I pass over to you for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. A pleasure to be with you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you to the organizers, particularly to Maureen and Paul and the team behind. Lynn, thank you for everything you've done to get me up to speed. So Lynn is sharing my presentation. I'm going to be very short because I know time is of the essence. I'm going to speak to three things. Firstly, I will talk about the history of the Africa Center, its relevance, its importance. Secondly, I will talk about a specific project which was very interesting for us at the Africa Center, which involved a secondment with Maureen joining us for 3 months from the UAL, and that being a potential way forward. It was essentially a kind of, for us, a learning experience, and I'm sure for Maureen as well. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about, I think, maybe some suggestions, some proposals, some ideas at the Africa Center, which we are working on. Of course, I stress I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner. I'm delighted to be amongst academics. My father was an academic, University of Lagos, Lusaka, Oxford. And so it's really, really exciting for me to be with you. So the Africa Center, first of all, if we can go to the next slide, it's a charity. One more, please, Lynn. It's a charity which was formed in 1964. It obtained charitable status then. Its home originally was in Covent Garden, but you can see there our new home that Paul referred to, which is in the heart of cultural Southwark. We're very proud of it. We launched it a week ago. It was opened by Sonia Boyce, Yinka Shonibare, and others, and we were thrilled to be joined by many, many people who remember the old Africa Center, and many, many people who are looking forward to the new Africa Center. Part of our history, in that history, we have a speech from Nelson Mandela when he was in Robben Island, read from the Africa Center. We have history with Alice Walker reading from the center, Lubena Hamid, who now has a huge exhibition at the Tate, one of her early exhibitions at the Africa Center, and of course Sonia Boyce as well, Ben Okri, Chimamanda Adichie, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Oliver Tambo. The list goes on and on and on. Sally Mugabe worked as an administrator at the Africa Center before she became First Lady. So I talk to that history, partly because we're proud of it, but partly also to say that we have very, very rich archives. And that is a point I'll refer to later. Those archives sit at the Metropolitan Archive Centre in London, and they're a rich depository, I think, for scholarly intervention and studentship. And again, I'll talk about that later. So if we move on to the next slide, again, that speaks to some of our key moments, our transition points I've talked about when we started. I've talked about the move, which was in 2013 from Covent Garden. We then won a grant, essentially, to build our new building, and that's phase one that you've seen. Next slide, please. So the building at phase one, which has just been finished, has a welcome space at the bottom. The first floor is essentially a lounge space, a relaxation area, a place for convivial chat, relaxation, discussion, debate. And the second floor is an exhibition space, an event space, which is presently housing an exhibition by a very exciting Tanzanian artist called Sungi Mungea. She is based in Kampala from Tanzania, has spent time in Kenya, and I think speaks to one of the key pillars of the Africa Center, which is to act as a platform for practitioners, for artists, for artisans, for creatives who are working and practicing on the continent, but putting them in London, which of course is a global platform space. And so Sungi's work is now there, causing a real ripple. And it's important and interesting to engage in discussions with her about how it is, what it's like to work on the continent. Phase two of our building, which hasn't started yet, will see us have an education and research center on the third floor, and then the fourth floor will be a business and innovation hub, which will focus on Black businesses exclusively. We think that's important, and Black creatives. When I say Black, of course, from the African diaspora, African continent, and a larger Africa, Friends of Africa. Next slide, please. That was our opening program, and I will leave that now, but Paul mentioned it. And that we focused on the idea of being a vibrant celebration of arts and culture and innovation. And we wanted to launch a sort of safe space for intergenerational discussion. What does it mean to be African? We want candid discussions to take place about our history, our identity, and our future. And we want to redefine some of the narratives, the false narratives around Africa by engaging young people. So we can leave the slides, and I just want to talk now about the brief example I gave when Maureen came to join us for a 3-month sabbatical. It was affected by COVID to some extent, unfortunately, so a lot of it was online, but it was between September and December, September 2021 to December 2021. And the aim of the secondment was to explore a sustainable relationship between the Africa Centre and UAL, a partnership of mutual benefit to both organizations, and indeed providing personal professional development opportunities and to look at knowledge exchange practices. Maureen was with us a day and a half a week. It wasn't enough for us, but it was great to have her, focusing on really 3 things, of which only really 2 happened, because the third, there just simply wasn't time and was COVID impacted. The first was our launch, and Maureen played a great role in that. One of the sessions that we will have post-launch is focusing on African leadership and what does it mean these days, and who are our new leaders, who are our old leaders, how can we learn from some of the errors of old, and what does leadership mean in terms of participation of all of us, and where does fault lie to the extent that we've had failed leadership in Africa? Is it with us? Is it with them? Or is it a combination of the 2? That is something that we're going to hold. The second area that Maureen focused on was Young Africa. The Africa Centre has a Young Africa group, and really acting as a knowledge base to shape some of the questions for Young Africa with a relevance to the continent. Of course, the UK has a huge African contingency. Many of the young Africans, second generation, are once removed from Africa, but they have questions. They have provocative questions, they have gaps in knowledge, and they also have huge amounts to contribute in their own lived experiences and expectations. And Maureen helped to shape some of our discussions in that. And that culminated in a very exciting conference that we held at the Africa Centre joint with UAL. That was online again because of COVID, but that was around the creative industry and really asking questions around what young people expect from the creative industry. How can they really extract value from an industry which was worth pre-COVID 34 billion pounds to the UK economy, and of course a lot of that creativity coming from Africans and Black people. But do they really own their own currency? Do they control their currency? And those sorts of questions, and what do they need to ensure that value is going in the right direction? That conference was held in February online. It was extremely exciting, and we look to build on that in the future. The third area that Maureen was to help us with was the archives, but the Metropolitan Archive Centre was closed because of COVID, so we will come back to that. So finally, I just want to talk, having talked about the history of the Africa Centre, its importance, and what I would describe as an experimental thing for us, where we had a practitioner with an academic background, but a practitioner come into the centre for essentially a short sabbatical and to help with knowledge exchange. And I think that's an experiment we'd like to continue. The last area I want to talk about is really the future. And I don't know whether we've had the chance to, or people have looked at the African Youth Survey, which was published earlier this week. It really does make stark reading. The last time the African Youth Survey was published was 2 years ago in 2020. And at that time, just over 40% of young Africans between the ages of 18 to 24 were optimistic about the continent. That has now dropped to 32%. optimistic about Africa's future. I think the highest optimism is in Rwanda, followed by Ghana, and sadly Nigeria comes very low down that list. But the study was extremely illuminating when it looked in detail at some of the reasons why young people had completely lost faith in the continent, and indeed in themselves to some extent, and certainly in us. We met yesterday, publishers of that report, the foundation that published it, which is based in South Africa. And we talked about how that report can be essentially launched from the Africa Center, and how it may be, we can do that in a way that excites interest from diaspora Africans, and indeed from Africans in Africa, and bring to life that report. Coincidentally, there was a report in the Sunday Times around Nigerian emigration to the UK, which is written sharply with young people leaving Nigeria. Again, sad, and I speak as not a young person, but somebody obviously is not in Nigeria now, but is often in Nigeria. And then a report in The Guardian as well, again talking about African emigration and that talent drain. So I think this is something we need to seriously look at. And when we're talking about knowledge exchange, and when we're talking about some of the key issues that have been raised by Professor Paul Goodwin, and challenge us to think about it, young people have to be at the heart of that thinking. They have to be at the heart of our questioning and indeed our listening. So that's something we are looking at launching from the Africa Center later this year. And for me, that's one of the key functions the Africa Center must play in being that bridge between Africans here and Africans abroad, and indeed being that bridge between non-Africans all over the world. The second example of what I see as the Africa Center's role is that the Lagos Biennale will take place next year. For those of you who've been at the Lagos Biennale, it's a very exciting, raw event, which basically happens with very little funding. But we're already in discussions with a curator who's based in the US and Lagos, and sometimes London, around a pavilion that he is creating in Freedom Square in Lagos, and also part of the Biennale being essentially staged from the Africa Center. So that for us is extremely exciting, where we have essentially a dual Biennale. We will show a bit of it. It's about futurism. It's about creating a new world for young people. It's about reimagining how they would live and what they want to do, but doing that through art. We're very excited about that. It's with a young South African artist. He's playing a key role in that. No. So that's the second thing. And the last thing I wanted to mention was this idea of artists essentially being showcased, amplified, supported in the UK. But artists that are based on the continent, of course, we don't ignore African artists that are based here, but we're particularly interested in examining the relationship between Africans who work on the continent and the idea of facilitating a way in which they can have access to a far greater audience, far greater collector base, far greater research base by showcasing at the Africa Center. And of course, we did that through Sungiri Mangeya. We also did that in our opening, where we examined much more closely this incredible Mozambican artist, Malangatana, and we looked at his life as a poet, as an activist, as an academic, and indeed we unveiled his mural in the Africa Center. And fortunately for us, we were thrilled by the fact that his daughter was able to join us in that journey, which was extremely exciting. But what does Malangtana's practice mean for artists today? What does what he was saying about the importance of owning our own futures mean for Africans today? How do we connect what some of the older generation was saying with the younger people to make sure that they see the relevance and importance and the connections indeed of what was said before, what was said now, and what may be said in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Oba, for that contribution, and of course the importance of investing and centering young people to inspire their confidence and vision in Africa, especially in the back of that the report that you mentioned, also for thank you for outlining in a way and giving us a sense of the historical importance and continuing importance of the Africa Centre in London. Obviously, we invite collaborations from colleagues in the continent to get in touch and to be involved in our programs as we move forward. So we unfortunately are running out of time. So can I ask our contributors to come back into the room, to turn your cameras on? We, I think with permission, we would like to just extend this last section now for another 10 minutes or so into a lunch. Now that is going into lunch break. Bit dangerous to ask people to extend and to cut short their lunch breaks, but we'll give that a go if that's okay. And I think there's a couple of questions that have come up in relation to this panel, which I will just quickly read out now. So question one was by Jesse Musa Kasinda. Asking panel contributors, how can we enhance research partnership in the context where the government officials are not interested in investing or funding research? So the problem of getting African governments to be interested in funding research when in the context of partnership. That's one question. Second question is how African universities and scholars can take advantage of the existence of multinational companies operating in the continent to develop partnerships where both parties can win. And I think Ajoma kind of referenced a little bit of the difficulties of in relation to data. Perhaps Ajoma, do you want to start with that, with your response?
Sure. Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for the question. I think at the end of the day, it's about mutual value. I think as a sector, we need to be much better at articulating our value. And I'm not talking just about economic value here. I'm talking about the role that the arts can play in expression, well-being, all of those things that we all know about and are passionate about and care about. I think for us to develop partnerships, we need to understand sort of where the multinationals are coming from and articulate the value that we can bring in terms of what the interests of those multinationals are, at that sweet spot where our interests and the interests of those multinationals overlap. I think similarly to the idea of driving, as was discussed in the previous panel, about the idea of the research agenda as being driven by foreign money, there is a risk, of course, that if all of our research is funded by multinationals, and I'm not suggesting that we're anywhere close to that, but we also need to be mindful that at the end of the day, multinationals' first interest is the multinationals and their profits. And so I guess we just need to be careful in developing these partnerships to not lose ourselves in pursuit of the financial or economic or any other type of value that we can get from multinationals. But to answer your question directly, I think it's about articulating the value and finding the spots where our interests align with theirs. And it's not an easy thing to do. I know that in many contexts, many people have tried to, get access to these multinationals. It's not always easy. I think, again, intermediaries can play a role here, because if higher education institutions, for example, or hubs like mine, for example, are playing an effective intermediary role, then we can start to do more to connect these interests and sort of facilitate those collaborations. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you, Ajoma. Does anyone want to, we've only got 9 minutes left, so does anyone want to come in on the question of the African government supporting or not supporting research collaborations?
Paul, if I may,
yes, of course.
What I do want to talk to is what do we do when we don't get support, right? So I can say, as someone who founded a digital festival, I can't tell you how many people thought it would fail, how many people just tried to discourage me from it. But I think there has to, I suppose one of the things that we do know, that when you don't have, that's when you innovate. So I really want to appeal to colleagues that I recognize where our governments don't support us, but I think that we can do so much with what we have. And what I learned from establishing a festival, which is now in its 8th year, is that I needed to call on so many colleagues, certainly locally, as well as students. So young people, I got a lot of support from young people around creating a festival that really was co-created. And lastly, what really stood out for me was the partnerships with other colleagues in the global south. So I was lucky enough to, through the International Symposium on Electronic Art, to forge a partnership with colleagues in Brazil at the Federal University of Santa Maria at Lab Inter around media art projects. And that really helped me to get across my message around certainly STEAM, making sure that we get our colleagues from other disciplines to work with us. And really, it was just because I decided, well, no, I'm not going to take no for an answer. The second point I wanted to make about international partnerships, I mean, I think I'm fortunate in that all the universities I have worked at had international partnership divisions, which are crucial. And I think in the earlier panels, someone did mention this. And so they were able to help me really to set up the collaborations and partnerships. So working with the Superior School of Art in Reunion Island, something I wouldn't have done had there not been someone supporting me to do that. Working with the Beijing Institute for Fashion Technology would not have been possible without the support of the Confucius Institute. So sometimes I think it's really just about being able to say, okay, so-and-so doesn't want to help me, that's fine, but I am going to make it happen and work with colleagues and partners who really do want to collaborate.
Thank you, Renee. Now, we've only got a few minutes left, but what I would like to suggest is that in the 5 minutes we have left, is if I can go around to each of you to just give one or two, maybe one solution to this issue of, how we forge these partnerships and how we strengthen research infrastructure and collaborations and partnerships across the continent and beyond. So if I can just go through each one of you to do that, starting with Toussaint, and then we'll close out the session. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carl. I think my colleagues actually who spoke before have mentioned very, very important key questions, I think, or elements that I could, build on. Basically, I believe the point would be to give scholars that autonomy and independence that they need, because, money has to come from somewhere by all means, and enable and empower those researchers to do the work. And the work that we're doing has to remain neutral and objective in the sense that it should not be conditioned by who is the giver, whether it is the public sector or the private sector. Money has to be there, and resources have to be made available to allow scholars to continue doing the work they're doing. How do we get to do this? I believe it is the whole point of not selling the freedom of academia or research simply because you want to serve some purpose or some interest. And I believe that listening and paying attention to those areas where government have been really fragile and lacking, and strengthening the kind of international collaboration is something that is profoundly needed, especially, as I was saying, maybe through such intermediaries like the associations, organizations of the nature of the SAAA, or some journals that we can also fund to allow African voices to get heard. Okay, I will leave it there to allow.
Thank you so much, Toussaint. Maureen, did you want to come in there? I think you've raised your hand with the point you wanted to raise.
Go and let the speaker say, and then I'll come in at the end. It's just
okay. So just if we can just be brief, speakers. Sorry about this. Oba, do you want to just give a brief solution from your perspective?
From my perspective, obviously from the Africa Center, it's offering placements and live work opportunities for people to actually spend time at the Africa Center, spend time with our archives, spend time with some of our key core objectives. And I think that's something that we would certainly be very interested in.
Thank you so much. Ojoma, do you want to quickly give us a...
quick solution. I think we need more open access to data sets that are held by big technology companies for researchers to interact with.
Here. It's really super important. Thank you so much. Renee?
No, thanks so much. Definitely fully supported, but I think we just need commitment and will. I mean, we are here, many of us are on this call. We're ready to collaborate and to partner. I think if there's commitment and will to it, I think that really we can do this in a way that's, as I mentioned earlier, that's inclusive and that prioritizes allyship.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Taibat.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's important that data be open and that the partnerships be more cyclical, not only top down, but also bottom up.
Great, thank you. I mean, apologies that we didn't get a chance to have a conversation, although the theme of the conference is to listen. I think we've listened to you today, to some really diverse and powerful perspectives from across the continent and in the diaspora. So thank you to everyone, to Toussaint, to Oba, to Joma, to Renee, to Taibat. I'll just hand over now quickly to Maureen to take us out of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for sharing such a provocative, discussion, and to all the speakers. What it's really highlighted, and I've learned so much from the session, is, the real value in research and knowledge, and how important it is that we are actually using that in the development and growth of Africa. That's one. And the second is around, listening to the different types of research. It's how we find, I like that term that was mentioned, the kind of the sweet point, or that intersection where we can use these research. The piece on young people was really fascinating, to hear. And also we have a scenario with, private companies who are producing a huge amount of research, but they're actually using it for their own purpose. It's not going back into, Africa, and we are contributing to those. So we need to find a way to ensure that we have a bigger stake in what's collected and the purpose for which it's being collected, and it's used to our advantage and to continue to build Africa. So thank you all once again, and thank you for the audience. And we now have break for lunch. We were back at 2 o'clock. And thank you to the production team.
Thanks, Maureen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.